The series Squid Game has become a global phenomenon, astonishing viewers with its brutality, tension, and profound social subtext. And I'll tell you right away, I watched it quite recently, and both seasons at once. And although the plot of the series is a work of fiction, it reflects real issues in South Korean society. And let's analyze exactly how. This is base by base. The first season is the story of desperate people plunged into a deadly game for the sake of a huge cash prize. The main character, Gi-hun, is a loser with debts. He agrees to a mysterious offer. And along with other participants, he plays children's games, but with a terrible outcome, because losing equals death. Behind the scenes are mysterious masked organizers. Among the players, there is betrayal, alliances, and a struggle for survival. In the finale, Gi-hun wins but loses faith in humanity. The second season takes viewers to the past, revealing the origins of the game. We learn how an ordinary person who created the games for entertainment turned them into a bloody business. Simultaneously, we are shown how Gi-hun, shaken by what he has seen, decides to fight the system. He returns to the game to put an end to these games forever. And the second season is interrupted, leaving viewers in the dark. But I am not so much interested in analyzing the series itself, but rather what motivated the director to build his story around despair, children's games, and the thirst for money. And the first is economic inequality. The participants of the games are people who have found themselves at the bottom of society. The unemployed, debtors, those who have lost everything. They are willing to risk their lives for a chance to win money that will change their fate. And do you know why such an idea originated specifically in South Korea? After all, South Korea was supposed to become a showcase of capitalism in contrast to the North. The West, and especially the USA, invested billions of dollars in Korea. They provided them with technology and equipment. Thanks to this, in a few decades, South Korea transformed from a poor, war-torn country into an economic tiger, with Seoul skyscrapers, advanced technologies, and K-pop. But who doesn't know Samsung, Hyundai, or LG? Everyone knows them. But behind this shiny facade lies another reality. A reality of inequality, poverty, and despair. Squid Game quite accurately reflects this side. One of the key issues is the hyper-concentration of the economy in the hands of cables, large family conglomerates. Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Lotte Group, these are all chaebols. And what happens when monopolization increases? Exactly. Companies gain monopoly power, inflate prices on their goods, and purchase raw materials and labor cheaper than under competitive conditions. These companies, on one hand, act as engines of growth, but on the other hand, they suppress small and medium-sized businesses, increasing the exploitation of workers to levels often incompatible, even with their reproduction. Workers, I mean. And in this country, South Korea, there is the highest suicide rate in the world and the lowest birth rate. In the center of Seoul, among the sparkling displays of luxury cars, you can find people living in cardboard boxes under bridges. They are called chajae, saengdan, those who survive on the fringes of society. Among them are elderly people who once built South Korea's economic miracle, but now find themselves unwanted. Unlike many other developed countries, South Korea spends relatively little on social programs. For example, spending on pensions amounts to only 3.5% of GDP. Which is significantly below the OECD average. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where the average is 8%. And according to the same OECD, South Korea ranks first in terms of elderly poverty. About 43% of elderly South Koreans live below the poverty line, which is nearly half. This is the highest rate among developed countries. And despite having a pension system, the size of the pension in Russia is irrelevant. Pensions in South Korea remain among the lowest, again, among developed countries. And the average pension is only 30% of the average salary, which is significantly lower than the OECD average of 58%. And many elderly people are forced to continue working or live in poverty. And it's not only the elderly who suffer from inequality, the youth also face challenges. Unemployment among young people aged 15 to 29 is about 9%. And many of those who work receive low wages and are forced to live in goshwons. These are tiny rooms that resemble capsules in a way. In South Korea, thousands of low-income people, including students and workers, live in these goshwons or goshitels, as they are also called. These spaces, only about 5 square meters in size, are so crammed with things that they barely fit one person. Such rooms first appeared in the late 70s as temporary housing for students who are preparing for exams. But today they have become a refuge for many who cannot afford regular housing due to real estate prices in Seoul. And let's look at the prices. The rent for such a goshewon ranges from 200 to past 300,000 won. That's approximately 16,000 rubles per month. And this is significantly cheaper than a regular apartment. For comparison, renting a one-room apartment requires a deposit of about 100 million won, which is 5.4 million rubles. In a system where the tenant pays a large deposit instead of monthly payments. Here's an example for you. Photographer Sim Kyu-dong, who lived in goshewons himself, decided to show what these tiny spaces look like. In his photos, people who barely fit among books, clothes, and dishes. The rooms usually have only a bed and a table, and the bathroom is shared on the floor. And the residents cook their food next to the bed and their belongings dry on the roof, where they also store pillows and blankets, which naturally deteriorate quickly due to rain and other bad weather. Goshewons have become a symbol of social inequality in South Korea. They even appear in expensive districts of Seoul, where rent reaches 600,000 won. This is approximately 32,000 rubles per month. By Moscow standards, this is not very expensive, but these are the rates in South Korea. For many, this is the only way to survive in a city where housing prices have long been out of control. The gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow, and many people find themselves in a debt trap. There is a Gini coefficient that measures income inequality. It determines the income ratio of the top 10%. The wealthiest people in the bottom 10%. It has increased in South Korea from 0.25 in 1990 to 0.35 in 2023. In 2024, the household debt in South Korea amounted to about 91 million South Korean won per family, which is approximately $63,000. And the total household debt amounted to 105% of GDP, which is one of the highest rates in the world. For example, in Russia, it is about 22%. In the USA, 70%. In China, 62%. And over the last 10 years, household debts have increased by more than 50%. And again, this is much faster than the growth of the population's income, according to the same OECD data. It should be noted that South Korea has a good health insurance system that covers almost 100% of the population, well, 97%. It is one of the most affordable and effective healthcare systems in the world. It is known for its advanced medical technologies, highly qualified doctors, and ranks third in the world for healthcare system efficiency, according to the Bloomberg Healthcare Efficiency Index. These are the data from 2021. But social services in South Korea are unevenly distributed. Residents of rural areas and small towns often have limited access to quality medical and educational services. In rural areas, the number of doctors per capita is twice as low as in cities. Well, this is often the case in many countries, including South Korea. And the main character of Squid Game, Gi-hun, ends up in debt due to a failed business and gambling problems. His debts become the main reason for participating in the deadly games. All participants have huge debts. And to us it seems strange. Well, how could one accumulate so much debt? To risk their life for it. In our country, you can end up in such a situation in quite exceptional cases, for example, due to drugs or gambling addiction. But in Korea, it's a bit different. Debt is a really big problem for Koreans. People from a young age study and work to exhaustion, but this does not guarantee them a stable future. A typical case is debts for education and housing, which are impossible to pay off. Student loans alone amount to about 10 million won there. That is approximately $7,500 per person. And according to a study by the Korea Institute of Finance, more than 60% of young people have debts related to education, housing, or consumer loans. Another reason for debt is the rapid rise in real estate prices, especially in Seoul and major cities. I already mentioned the prices to you, and many people take out mortgages to buy housing, but again, due to high prices, their debts become overwhelming. For instance, the average price of an apartment in Seoul is about 1 billion won. That's around 57 million rubles. For many families, this means they have to pay off the mortgage for decades. A familiar problem, right? South Koreans, among other things, actively use credit cards and consumer loans. This is related to the culture of consumption and the availability of credit, surprisingly enough. More than 40% of households have outstanding consumer loans, according to the Financial Supervisory Service, as of 2023. Monopolies are not eager to enrich their workers, so wage growth is increasingly lagging behind inflation. The minimum wage in South Korea in 2023 was 9,621, which is about $7 per hour, This is approximately 2 million won, or one-fifth $100 per month, which barely covers basic expenses. Debts are also linked to a culture that forces constant competition. People take out loans to invest in their future. Well, invest is what they call it. Pay for tutors for their children, buy expensive clothes for interviews, start their own business. However, it's clear that not everyone succeeds, and the debts remain. This is evidenced by the growing number of personal bankruptcies. In 2022, in South Korea, it reached 60,000 cases, and it continues to grow. And I probably won't surprise you if I say that debts put enormous pressure on a person's mental health. The Korean Health Institute assures that more than 30% of people with debts suffer from depression or anxiety disorders. But the government is trying to do something to address the problem. For example, it implements restructuring programs, writes off part of the debts, and introduces rules limiting the issuance of consumer loans. But it's hard to say that this makes things significantly better. In South Korea, there is a very strong cultural stigma around receiving social assistance. Many people are embarrassed to seek help, even if they need it. And of course, bureaucratic barriers haven't gone anywhere. And only 30% of people who are eligible for social assistance actually receive it. This was our discussion on social inequality. In Squid Game, there was another very interesting moment that is not quite understandable to people from other cultures. It's gambling. And gambling, of course, is a problem in many countries. In general, gambling addiction is classified as a mental disorder according to ICD-10, and the World Health Organization gives this disorder the name pathological gambling addiction. It is estimated that about 1% of people worldwide suffer from gambling addiction. In South Korea, this figure is 5%. And essentially, this is another reason for the large debts and explains why Gi-hun is understandable and relatable to local characters. South Korea has one of the strictest anti-gambling laws in the world. According to the law, citizens of the country are prohibited from gambling in casinos on South Korean territory. An exception is made only for foreigners and one casino for local residents. This is Gangwon Land, which is located in a remote mountainous area. However, the reality is that the bans only encourage people to seek workarounds. And despite all the prohibitions, underground gambling thrives. And according to estimates by the Korean Institute of Criminology, the annual turnover of illegal gambling is about 100 trillion won, or $75 billion. With the development of the internet, gambling has moved to the online space. More than 1 million South Koreans regularly participate in online betting. But why are gambling games so popular? The fact is that in South Korea, they have very deep cultural roots. Traditional games, such as hwatu, a card game, were popular even in ancient times. And today, this tradition has transformed into modern forms of gambling. And many people see gambling as a way to get rich quickly, especially in the face of this intense competition and economic inequality. For some, it becomes the last hope for a better future. There was even a survey conducted by the Korean Institute of Health. It showed that more than 30% of players start gambling due to financial difficulties. Moreover, despite the bans, gambling is easily accessible through underground casinos, online platforms, and even mobile apps. Many of these platforms are based abroad, making it difficult for authorities to control them. Take, for example, Chang Mi-soo. She is a 34-year-old office worker from Seoul. She started playing in online casinos 3 years ago after losing her job. She says, at first it was just entertainment, but then I started losing more and more. I took out loans, sold my car, and even stole money from my parents. And today, Chang Mi-soon is undergoing treatment at the rehabilitation center for gamblers. And her story, which I read on an internet portal, is not an exception. Thousands of South Koreans find themselves in similar situations, losing money, family, and health. And about 10,000 thousands of South Koreans undergo treatment for gambling addiction annually, and the government shuts down hundreds of illegal casinos. Gambling addiction, evidently, often leads to enormous debts. According to a study by the National Gambling Control Commission, the average debt of a gambler is about 50 million won. That's about $37,000. So inequality, games, and also hyper-competition. The games in the series resemble children's games, but with deadly outcomes. It's a metaphor for fierce competition, where losing means collapse. South Korea is indeed known for its hyper-competition, They even have such a culture, which starts with education and ends with work. Children study for 12-14 hours a day to get into a prestigious university, and adults work overtime to keep their jobs. And let me tell you more. South Korea ranks second in the world for the number of working hours per year. That's 1,967 hours for the year 2022. And of course, this leads to a monstrous level of stress and emotional burnout. Moreover, the government only reduced the maximum work week from 68 to 52 hours in 2018. Let me remind you that in Russia it's 40 hours. There is also a problem such as social isolation. Participants in games find themselves isolated, cut off from the outside world. They are forced to rely only on themselves, which intensifies this monstrous, oppressive atmosphere of despair. And social isolation is also a serious problem. In South Korea, especially among the elderly and the youth, the suicide rate among the elderly is 43.7 per 100,000 people, which is significantly higher than the national average. And many young people feel isolated due to societal pressure and economic difficulties. And rare stories like this one. Lee Min-jo, a 28-year-old university graduate. She dreamed of becoming a journalist, but after a year of job searching, she took a temporary position at a call center. Her salary barely covers the rent for a room in that very gauche-hotel and her food expenses. She says, "I feel trapped. I work, but I can't even afford to rent a decent apartment. And even thinking about family and the future is terrifying." Her story is not an exception at all. Many people in South Korea are facing the N generation syndrome. They are giving up on relationships, marriage, children, and even their own dreams because they can't afford them. There have become so many recluses that the South Korean government decided to allocate nearly $500 to young people to encourage them to leave their homes. For reclusiveness, which is called NEET in the West, there is a term in the East, hikikomori. It literally means to withdraw into oneself. In South Korea, this phenomenon is very widespread. According to the Korean Institute for Health and Social Affairs, about 350,000 people, young people aged 19 to 39, consider themselves lonely or isolated. This is about 3% of the country's youth. And many of them begin to lead a reclusive lifestyle even in their teenage years. Another issue reflected in the Squid Game is the inhumanity of the system. The organizers of the games treat the participants as expendable. Their lives do not matter. The main thing is entertainment for the wealthy spectators. And in South Korea, there is a problem of devaluing human life, especially in the context of labor and social protection. These low pensions and weak social support leave many elderly people in poverty. Many workers face unfair working conditions and low wages. These are not just words, these are data from the Ministry of Labor. In South Korea, as in many other countries, there are dark chapters in history related to shelters and social institutions. Now I will tell you one of the darkest, and at the same time, a real story of the Brothers' Shelter, which existed in the city of Busan, in the 1970s-80s. This place became a symbol of cruelty and inhumanity, and its history still evokes horror and outrage. The Brothers' Shelter was founded in 1975 as an institution to help the homeless, the destitute, and people with disabilities. On paper, it appeared to be a charitable organization meant to care for the most vulnerable segments of society. However, the reality turned out to be much darker. The owner of the shelter, Park Seung-se, and his staff turned this place into a real hell. People who were brought to the shelter were often forcibly taken from the streets. The police or local authorities collaborated with the shelter to, clean the city of undesirable elements. And among the so-called residents were not only the homeless, but also those considered inconvenient. The disabled, the elderly, various homeless children, and even those who simply found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. People in the shelter were kept in horrifying conditions. They were forced to work to exhaustion on construction sites, factories, and farms that belonged to the shelters. And there was a catastrophic shortage of food and water, while medical assistance was non-existent. Those who tried to resist or attempted to escape were brutally beaten and tortured. And there were even quite a few cases of murder. According to the testimonies of survivors, the shelter was dominated by an atmosphere of complete lawlessness and fear. The mortality rate in the shelter was extremely high. People died from hunger, diseases, exhaustion, and cruel treatment once again. And the bodies were buried in mass graves on the shelter's grounds or burned to hide the traces of the crimes. And according to estimates, during the existence of the shelter, hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people died there. There was a journalistic investigation that uncovered the horrors of the shelter for the brothers. And this investigation became one of the most high-profile and shocking in the history of South Korea. It not only led to the closure of the shelter, but also stirred society, prompting people to think about how the state and society treat the most vulnerable groups. And here's how it happened. In 1987, journalists from the newspaper Kukmin Ilbo received an anonymous tip-off that terrible things were happening in the brothers' shelter. The source, who was later revealed to be a former employee of the shelter, spoke about massive human rights violations, torture, and forced labor, and even about murders. And the journalists, realizing that this could be a major expose, began a secret investigation. To gather evidence, they took a risky step. One of them went undercover and got a job at the shelter. This allowed him to see everything from the inside. What he discovered exceeded the darkest expectations. People lived in overcrowded rooms without basic amenities. Many slept on the concrete floor without blankets or mattresses. There was complete unsanitary conditions everywhere. The shelter residents were forced to work 12-14 hours a day on construction sites, and those who refused or couldn't cope were brutally beaten. The journalists witnessed beatings, torture, and humiliation. People were tied, for example, to poles, starved, subjected to various other forms of violence. And alongside their undercover work, the journalists searched for survivors who could confirm their findings. And they found several people who managed to escape from the shelter. Their stories were, well, simply heart-wrenching. One of the former residents, whose name was not disclosed, said he was taken from the street while he was just begging. Well, it sounds like the characters from Squid Game, doesn't it? In the shelter, he was forced to work on construction, and when he tried to escape, he was beaten nearly to death. He also said that he saw people dying from hunger and disease, and their bodies were simply thrown into mass graves. And in November 1987, the newspaper Kukmin Ilbo published a series of articles that exposed the horrors of the brothers' home. The articles were accompanied by photographs and testimonies from survivors. The publications caused shock throughout the country. People could not believe that such things could happen in modern, prosperous South Korea. The public demanded the immediate closure of the home and punishment for those responsible. Protests and demonstrations took place across the country, and the issue became a major news topic. And under public pressure, the authorities were forced to act. The brothers' home was closed, and its owner Park Geun-se and several employees were arrested. However, the court was lenient. Park received only 4 years in prison, and many employees escaped punishment. This caused a new wave of outrage, as people believed the punishment did not match the severity of the crimes. And the investigation into the brothers' home had far-reaching consequences. The story of the shelter prompted the authorities to reconsider the social welfare system and the protection of vulnerable groups. Measures were taken to prevent similar abuses in the future. The investigation uncovered issues of corruption, cruelty, and indifference in society, and it served as a reminder of the importance of protecting human rights. The story of the brothers' home became part of South Korea's cultural memory. It inspired documentaries, books, and artistic works that address issues of social justice. Evidently, Squid Game also became one of such works of art. And in the 2010s, mass graves were discovered on the site of the former shelter. Experts estimated that the remains of hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people could be there. This discovery once again drew attention to the tragedy and prompted the authorities to start an investigation to identify the victims. And although the history of the brothers' shelter is not directly related to the plot of Squid Game, it certainly reflects the themes that are understood in this series. Cruelty, inequality, the struggle for survival in a society where human life is often devalued. And also, the participants of the games in the series hope that winning will solve all their problems. This is an illusion that makes them risk their lives. And many South Koreans are looking for ways to get rich, whether it's through gambling, investments, or participating in financial pyramids. Well, as I already mentioned, the turnover of illegal gambling is about 100 trillion won, or 75 billion US dollars. There is such an indicator as the level of happiness. Different organizations calculate it differently, but let's take, for example, the UN index. They assess it through the World Happiness Report, where key factors are taken into account. Among them are material well-being, which is measured through GDP per capita, and the level of social support, meaning the ability to rely on others in difficult times. Also important are life expectancy, the sense of freedom of choice and control over one's life, the generosity of people willing to help others, and the level of corruption, which also affects trust in society. And to the figures, it adds subjective data, surveys where people assess their own happiness. So, according to the World Happiness Report for 2023, South Korea ranks 59th out of 146 countries. And this is lower than many other developed countries. For example, Finland is in first place, and Japan, which is very close to South Korea, is in 47th place. And according to a Gallup Korea survey, only 59% of South Koreans consider themselves happy, while 38% are pessimistic about the future of the Korean economy. According to the OECD, South Korea ranks 35th out of 38 countries in terms of life satisfaction. And only Turkey, Colombia, and Russia are below it, and Greece. And you know what? Squid Game is not just a thrilling series, it's a powerful social critique. It shows how economic inequality, debt, hyper-competition, and social isolation destroy people's lives. The story of the series is the story of South Korea, where behind the glimmer of neon lights lie shadows of despair and hopelessness. It's especially important to compare South Korea with North Korea, as it's one country that was divided, with socialism in one and capitalism in the other. But I will definitely cover that in other videos. Today, I'll just say that the series makes us think about what we are willing to do for money. And what happens to a society where human life is devalued?